Okay, class, this is our strength training, exercise 122, lecture number 6, and this is about exercise order. Now, this lecture isn't only going to detail the exercise order of how you should be able to categorize and explain things in individual sessions, but also looking at kind of like a bigger model. Okay, so when we're talking about training, and we're talking about progression, we're talking about consistency, we're talking about overload and how we can try to help somebody continually progress along to reach their goals. These things take time, okay? It's not, we don't live in a world where things happen quickly as far as the adaptations we're looking for, even though that's what's been presented to the world as far as from a marketing, social media standpoint. It's an increase your vertical jump in 2 weeks, or lose 20 pounds in 10 days, or whatever thing is being sold. Everyone tries to sell this quick, easy, no work process. And the fact of the matter is attaining these goals and changing your body takes time. It takes work. And it also takes planning. Okay? And that's really what this lecture is about. It's about planning. It's about how to plan and a universal terminology that everyone can use to describe their plans and how they're thinking about plans for whatever adaptation you're looking for, okay? So it's important to have an understanding of all these things so that basically you can be in the same conversation as another professional in the field, right? So if you're trying to work with somebody, I'm going to go with athletes because that's kind of the world I live in. If I want to have a conversation with another coach about, hey, what did you do during this mesocycle? I have to have an understanding, and they have to have an understanding of what I'm talking about when I say that, so that we can both have a conversation, right? Basically what we're doing is getting you accommodating to the names of the tools, right? So if you're a carpenter or a construction worker, if you don't even know what the name of the tools are that you're using, well then how can you even be in a conversation or expect somebody to be able to work with you, right? If someone says, hey, go grab this tool, or go grab that saw, or go grab that hammer, or whatever it may be, and you go, I don't know what that is, well then you're not really helpful at that point, right? You're not even at a point where you can even have the conversation about what you want to do. So that's why this lecture is important, because it's basically giving we're allowing you to step in the door by knowing this stuff. Now, as far as having the conversations about what to do and how to pick what to do, that's kind of for another day, another lecture, another class. That's more the strength and conditioning theory kind of side of things. And as you progress through the program, you will get to that. This is just a basic introduction to planning, to what that means, okay? So a lot of this is kind of definition, terminology based. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read each thing, and then I'm gonna read the description that is on here, and I'm just gonna kind of give some input on that, okay? I would suggest having notes out. I would suggest having this sheet ready to go, and then whenever I kind of give something that I think is important or key, write that next to it, okay? Because you do have to know what all of these mean for the test, but I also, like I said, you need to know all these things as a way to just have a conversation in the field, right? This isn't one of those things where you can get away with not knowing what periodization is, or you can't not have an understanding of what an accessory exercise is, right? And that's something that goes whether you're PT, whether you are clinical, whether you are personal training, sports performance, these are things that you have to have an understanding of to from the practicality side of things. I know that there's a lot of information that you might think is not useful. Well, I'm telling you that this is useful stuff, and I would really try to understand what I'm saying and try to understand the different concepts that we're about to go over for your sake, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is just kind of define what we're talking about when we say exercise order. So it's basically the sequence of resistance exercise performed during one training session, okay? So, we have certain movements and exercises that we've even gone over up to this point as far as the movement patterns, right? There's probably exercises that in your head. Well, one of the things we have to determine is like, what's the order, right? So, if we, think about any album of music that you like, right? There's a specific order to the music that's on there, right? To give the best delivery of that product or of that content, So you kind of have to think about the training and the workouts that you write as kind of like an album, right? Like, what is the best way to organize these things to deliver the best content? So that's what we're going to go over, and the key is that you have to have an understanding of compound exercises, accessory exercises, and stabilizing exercises, okay? So those three things were kind of a way to differentiate what we need to do and like what types of movements should be put as priority, basically. So a compound movement is something that is bigger. Okay, it's something that involves more musculature. It's something that has a higher demand energy-wise. It's something that essentially is like kind of more complex and harder. So if we think back to the movement patterns we've gone over up to this point, the compound movements are the ones at the end of the progressions. Okay, it's basically the hardest ones, but they're the hardest because they elicit the most stress because of the types of loads that we're using. So conventional deadlift is a compound movement. A barbell back squat is a compound movement, and even a barbell front squat would be a compound movement, okay? We haven't gone over these yet, but the Olympic lift variations are also compound movements. So a snatch, a hang clean, a power clean, okay? Those are things that would be like considered the most, like tax the most. It has the most involvement, and those are the things you want to do first from a general training standpoint. Now, if you're talking about, the difference between powerlifting and bodybuilding, and then the difference of that to even a gen pop, some people are like, I like to pre-fatigue muscles before I go do my compound stuff, right? That's for a specific adaptation for a specific person in like the bodybuilding world. So a common thing that people will do in bodybuilding is they will actually pre-fatigue and isolate a specific muscle before they go do the compound on it to elicit more eccentric damage, elicit more damage to the muscle to get it to grow bigger, right? Because that's their goal, that's their adaptation goal that they're looking for. For now, what I want you to do is kind of just reel it back to like a basic starting point of strength training. And that basic starting point of strength training is we want to emphasize quality of movement. So that basically, if you kind of think about it, it's like, how would we get the best quality of movement on those compound big things? Assuming that we've already progressed and we know how to do them correctly, then the best way to do that is in a state of freshness, not being fatigued. If you're fatigued, then you're more likely to break down in how the technique should look on that movement. And if you break down the technique and the movement, you risk injury. Okay? So at its core, that's kind of why we do the compound things first, right? We want to do it when we're the most fresh, where we can truly get the best technique and get the most out of that movement, which leads to the accessory exercises. So an accessory is it's kind of in the name. It's something that can pair well with what you have already done. So if you think about, bicep curl, tricep exercises, isolated push downs, lateral raises, certain rows can be compound. Like if I were to do that barbell bent over row, that would be considered a compound exercise only because it includes the whole body. But if I'm doing a, seated machine row, well, I'm really just trying to isolate the back at that point, and that would be considered an accessory. So on a day where I worked my upper back, like on something where, for example, a lot of people will do deadlift training because you have to keep your scaps depressed when you're doing that, in that stable position, right? So when you're doing deadlifts, you're still training that isometrically, but you're training that. People will actually go and work on accessory, their back after that. Okay, so understanding that you want to go compound, right, the big thing, and then you pair like what you need to on top of that. So getting a little bit of extra back, on top of that doing some bicep would be good on that day because you are pulling, you're resisting that. Those are things that you kind of like add in to put the cherries on top, right? And the last thing is those stabilizing exercises. So there are certain ways to train your core. The most common stuff that people think are like leg raises and Russian twists and, anything of that nature. You have to be careful with those because, the core itself is a very undefined, part of the body, and as far as like its use and how to train it, if you try to do research on like what is core training, some people say it's only the abdomen. Some people say it's from the hip flexors all the way up to the top of the rib cage, right? Your obliques are included. Some people don't include the obliques. So one thing you have to be careful with is if you do a lot of that, typical like ab circuit workout stuff, you're very prone to tightening up someone's hip flexors. And when people have tight hip flexors, it leads to back pain, it leads to improper movement. So there's certain ways to train your core, and I personally like stuff that emphasizes breathing and essentially movements of the like diaphragm and ensuring a stable spine, like a neutral spine. That's stuff that if you have more questions on, I want you to reach out to me. Other than that, I don't want you to worry about it. I want you to just understand that those usually come at the end, okay? Another thing that we can do for untrained individuals is we alternate upper body and lower body exercise, right? So we kind of talked about this already as far as like full body training, right? So when we're talking about the individual who is untrained, we want to elicit more stress because they're not going to be using significant loads anyway. So it's kind of a benefit to them to get more consistency and opportunity to train each muscle group in each movement, get more practice, right? So when we're doing that, one good way to pair or like to order that actual lift is to go back and forth between upper and lower, because you kind of get the benefit of you're hitting both, but you also get the benefit of while you're doing the upper, your lower body most likely is resting, and vice versa, right? So when I'm doing my lower body, my upper body might get a little bit of a break depending on the movement. Now there's some compound movements where that it's going to take on the whole body, but what it does is it really helps to minimize those rest times and helps maximize the rest time between body areas. So you can constantly keep going through the training session, right? Which is what we want. We want that full body, high pace stuff to try to get that general fitness up and to start eliciting some basic adaptations for these people while also getting that rest time, okay? Now, so an alternation of the upper body and lower body, that's just like a concept of how to write the session, right? When you're talking about circuit training, all of you have probably done some sort of circuit in your life, right? A circuit is not just a pairing, it's a grouping, right? So if we're looking at a grouping, it involves alternating exercise with minimal rest periods. Okay, so a circuit is really a way to define how to maximize your time, right? So, for those people who can't go to the gym for an hour and a half, for those people it might be good to say, you know what, we're going to have 2 circuits where, if we were going to go to the gym and we had time, right? Like let's say we're in a world where we do have time, right? We're going to do 4 pairings of 2. Right, so I do an upper and a lower, right, and then I go to an upper and a lower, right? That is still 4 sections of time that you have to account for. Well, in a circuit, what I might do is do 2 sections of 4, okay? And if I really decrease that rest time, I'm going to be having a more efficient session for the person that doesn't have time. So, we're all kind of in a spot now, right, where we're all quarantined at home. And in that quarantine, you have to get creative at how to maximize your time and kind of maximize the space that you have. So one thing that someone might be able to do is just circuit training, right? If it's something where they don't want to train at home and they're not willing to go for an hour and a half, well, it's like, give me 30 minutes a day. And in that 30 minutes, you hook up a circuit for them, or 2 or 3 different circuits, right? Where they can move and get more of that adaptation that we're looking for, okay? Now, push and pull exercises. Now, we have already talked about this, okay? And I've paired the pushes and pulls together in horizontal and vertical. The thing is, when you're talking about exercise order, especially when you're programming the horizontal pushes and pulls and the vertical pushes and pulls, is you want to pair them together, right? They're the horizontal push to pull and the vertical push to pull. They're opposites, right? So anytime I do a push, I would like to match that with a pull. A ratio of training for pushes to pulls, whether it's horizontal or vertical, is 1-to-1. That is the most basic and probably the safest way to go, if not going 1-to-2, 1 push to 2 pulls. So for somebody who has a really weak posterior, right, they're very bad at pulling and they have a really big imbalance, they're like this, that's somebody that you want to give them more pulls than you do pushes, okay? So understand we've already gone over the different pushes and the different pulls, but when you're talking about exercise ordering, like writing our album, right? When we're writing that, we want to write it in a way where the pushes and pulls are paired together one-to-one. Now, superset versus compound set. This is a big deal. You have to understand this because there's a key differentiation between the two. So a superset is two sequentially formed exercises that do not focus on the same muscle group, two exercises in a row. So what we just talked about, like the push and the pull. So if I were to do a bench press and pair it with a row, right? That's a push and a pull. It's opposite. It's not technically working the same thing. We know the working muscles of pushes, right, compared to the working muscles of pulls, right? They're different, right? So we're not working the same muscle group 2 times in a row. That's a superset. A compound set is when you are working the 2 exercises right in a row, okay? So these should focus on the same muscle group. So that would be if I were to do a bench press and then do a dumbbell press right in a row, right? So I do a set of bench heavy and then I go and do a set of dumbbell press, right? I'm working the same muscle group. That's a compound set. So it's very key that you have an understanding between the superset, which is not the same muscle group, to a compound set, which is the same muscle group, okay? It's a big differentiation. I would star that, I would highlight that, underline that, whatever you have to do, okay? So, from compound set up, that's really about exercise order when it comes to like writing our album essentially for that day, okay? Periodization and the rest of the stuff we're gonna talk about is further planning, right? It's bigger planning, right? This is like if we're going to use that music analogy, okay, then this would be the group or the music group planning out their next 4 albums. It's like, okay, so we have this album first. Well, what are we going to do next, right? How are we going to order things next? How are we going to release our best music after this, right? That's what periodization is. So the key is that periodization is a way to plan, but it's really planning about a way to manipulate what the intensity and volume of things that you're doing in respect to or relative to when you're actually going to like compete. And the reason it's framed that way is because periodization is more something that is it's more something that is geared towards like athletes and performance. So periodization is really a model that is for usually like planned events, right? So I need to have a periodized plan of things to do when I'm talking about athletes. I need to have a periodized plan when I'm talking about, football players, basketball players, baseball players, soccer players, powerlifters, weightlifters, throwers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any type of athlete should have a periodized plan of training, and it's all relative to when they're going to compete to guarantee or help get the best guarantee for them to have the best performance on the field or play or whatever it is, or the platform, right? Periodization is a little bit easier for barbell sports, right? Because the training that you're doing in the weight room in the strength training is 100% specific to what you're going to do in your sport. Right, so for a weightlifter or a powerlifter, like you're going to periodize a plan of barbell training or of different types of strength training relative to when they need to compete. So it's a little bit easier to do that compared to you have a football player or you have a basketball player. Well, there's a little bit more that goes into the periodization plan than just the strength training, right? It's not just about, hey, how much are we going to be lifting? It's like, well, how much are you going to be playing? What's the skill work? How much work are we emphasizing on like the tactical ability, right, of these players? Or how much are we going to, emphasize film? How much are we going to emphasize sprinting and jumping and this and that? Now, those decisions are more going to be talked about in the next lecture when we talk about the SED and FIT principles. So just understand that when we're talking about periodization, there's more to it than just the strength training. Okay? Everything needs to be included. A holistic model needs to be taken into account, but we all have to be within the same terminology. Okay? So when we're talking about a periodization plan, there's kind of 3 ways we break that down, right? So there's different, like, essentially cycles that we go through. So a macro cycle, right, is the entire year or many months up to 4 years of a training plan. So some people are able to write out what they want as far as a macro plan. Like, we're going to compete in the Olympics in 4 years. Okay? How are we going to progress our plan? How are we going to train? What intensities are we what adaptations are we looking for here? What goals do we have here, here, and here at this year, right? So the macro plan is the big plan, right? It's our overall evil global plan, right? The mesocycle is several weeks to several months, okay? And usually in the mesocycle is when you're targeting like an adaptation, like a specific goal, because these things take time. So for example, right, a typical powerlifting scheme would start off with several, like probably several weeks of hypertrophy, which we've already talked about, right? Hypertrophy is when we're trying, and for a powerlifter, we're going for that, not that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, we're going for that myofibrillar hypertrophy, where we're aiming to add more actinomycin to get more contractile strength. Right, so we're trying to build in that time frame, but in that time frame, those parameters for what hypertrophy requires, right, is a certain intensity, it's a certain reps, it's a certain rest, right? It's certain guidelines that elicit that, and it takes time to develop. So you have to kind of buy into that for that mesocycle. Then you go to the next one, and in that next mesocycle, we're going to build strength. So those parameters again change. Okay. And then the last one is the microcycle. So a microcycle is typically 1 week long, but it could last up to 4 weeks. So a microcycle, it's like, all right, this week, what am I doing? Like, what's the plan this week? So you have to work backwards in these plans because you have to know the end game. You have to know where you want to go. If you don't know where you want to go, then you can't make a decision about where you are right now. One of the best analogies I've heard for like, and this was more related to like someone's life and their entrepreneurship, was you're sitting in a dark room, okay? And in the middle of the room, there's a light and there's a chair, okay? So if I go up to the chair, and I'm trying to walk, well, like, how do I know which way I need to go around the chair? Do I like take a left and kind of veer off that way? Do I go all the way around the chair? Do I not even go up to the chair, right? All I know is that I have to walk past the chair, but I don't know where the end game is after that. So what I need is another light. I need a light at the back left corner of the room. Oh, I know, all right, so I'm starting over here. I need to walk around the chair, take a left, and go that way. The end game dictates how you move around the obstacle in front of you, right? And that's how you figure out the microcycle. The microcycle is determined by what mesocycle you're in for the big macrocycle. So it all starts at what the need is. What's the goal? The goal determines the plan, and then that plan will manifest itself and from a bigger and smaller and smaller until you get to, okay, what am I doing today? So that's an important concept that you have to know. You have to know what micro, meso, and macrocycle mean, and you should be able to define that, okay? So another way that you can describe periods of time, and this is more, talking about like sports specifically, is you have preseason, you got in-season, and you got postseason. Okay, so these are another way for people to kind of break down training. For team sports, this is a lot simpler of a way to break it down. You can still use the mesocycle, macrocycle, microcycle terminology, but a lot of people will, pretty much everyone knows, like, all right, hey, like they're in the off season right now, or hey, we're in preseason play, right? Or we're in season, or we're in postseason play. Like, everybody has a kind of understanding of what that means for team sports, so they'll kind of talk training that way, like, hey, in the preseason, we're going to really try to peak and attack this, or in the off season, we need to reel it back, we need to, rebuild our tissues, right? We need to get healthy. Whatever that terminology is, or the way they'll describe it, that's how they go about it. So when we're talking about talking in this way, in the preseason, this is like the leading up to the first game, right? So in the NFL, sorry about that, the camera cut off. But in the preseason of the NFL, that starts in August, right? So in August, we know that they get those 4 games where they're kind of, everybody can get that feel back for like the actual game itself, the competition, the arena, the environment, etc. This is really like the preparatory period, and this is that peak word I was talking about. So this is where like we're looking to get that strength power adaptation, right? We're really looking to peak. So it's like that first game is when you want to have your athletes at the peak of their competition. Now, in season, long seasons could be broken up into mesocycles to peak at critical points. So when we're talking about that, some people will actually like prioritize their training around the importance of the game. So when we look at like a basketball season, right? If East Conference team is playing a West Conference team, technically that game is not as important as an in-conference play, right? So, or an in-division play. So, teams will actually look at it and say, you know what, we can afford to do this type of training, which is a little bit more damaging, a little bit more intense. We can do that when we're playing this team that is irrelevant to our overall record, or to our overall standings in the Eastern Conference because we're playing in the Western Conference today, right? When we come back home, we have 3, Eastern Conference games in a row, 2 of them are divisional, then we need to really make sure that we're peaked at that time. So people will determine how they need to train in season depending on the importance of games and whatnot. And it can be broken up into different mesocycles. Now, the preseason training into the first few weeks of the season is basically to ensure the athletes don't peak too early or lose all the training before the end of the season. Okay, so basically that means that people are trying to maintain what they got in the off season, right, during in season. So you're trying to peak somebody when they get to the beginning of the season, but as we all kind of know, like the beginning of the season isn't the most important. The most important is the championship part of a season. So if you peak your athletes then and then you don't have a plan to maintain that or try to keep pushing that in season, you're going to most likely have declined performance. And what are we doing all this training for in this athletic world? It's for performance, right? So if you're training in a way that's not continuing to let you perform better on the field, well then your training is not accomplishing the goal, even though you might be getting stronger with a barbell, or you might be running faster times on lasers, right? The key is the performance on the field, and everything should be worked backwards from there, okay? And then lastly, we have the postseason. So the postseason is like right when the season's over, your body needs a true break, okay? So especially from like an NFL season, that can really take a toll on someone's body, so they might even take up to a month of active rest. Now that doesn't mean they don't do anything. It means they do different things, like they focus more on like their cardiovascular ability, right? They do some more swimming, or they do cycling, or they play, basketball a little bit. They do different things to give their joints, their tendons, their bodies, and even their minds, just a mental break from focusing on one sport, one position, one game to game to game, championship, fans, this and all that. Okay, so that's a way that you can kind of describe training. That's more in the team sport world. The periodization models, as far as like macro, meso, microcycle, that's more in the weightlifting, track and field, and powerlifting type of world. That terminology you'll kind of see more over there. When you're talking about the team sports, you'll mostly see the preseason, in-season, off-season kind of stuff, but you still should know both. Okay, now. Lastly, we're going to go over 2 types of periodization models, okay? So, we have the understanding of what periodization is and that it's a plan, right? But there's different ways for you to plan out eliciting and kind of prescribing stress. One of them is linear periodization. So linear periodization is just a gradual, progressive mesocycle that increases in intensity over time. Now, what it looks like right here is it's fluctuation in training load, but no change in volume. Okay, so basically on Tuesday we're going to do 4 sets of 6 with a 3 rep max load. Then on Thursday we're going to do 4 sets of 6 with a 10 RM load, and then on Saturday we're going to do 4 sets of 6 with a 6 RM load. Okay, so essentially what's happening is the volume is staying the same, but the intensity is just going like this, right? It's a nice linear curve. Okay, and the reason that that can benefit somebody is somebody who's a little bit newer, and we can really emphasize just gradually progressing over time. I will say with newer people and younger people, linear periodization is great. Okay, then you have something called undulating or nonlinear periodization. So this involves large daily fluctuations in the load and the volume. So what people use undulating models for is they'll actually use it for trying to target different adaptations within like a small period of time. So, because for athletes, they're not team sport athletes essentially, they're not like totally sold in on all right, we only need hypertrophy with a barbell, right? They might need other things as far as all right, we have to accomplish this, we have to accomplish this, this, and this. Okay, so that's why you see 4 sets of 5 with a 6 RM load, 3 sets of 10 with a 10 RM load, 5 sets of 3 with a 3 RM load. So there'll be differences. So if we look, that 4 sets of 5 with a 6 RM load, that's more of a strength type of adaptation. That 3 sets of 10 with a 10 RM load, that's more hypertrophy. And then we look at Saturday, we're doing 5 sets of 3 at 3 RM, that's more of like a peaking thing, like a peak strength. So they're trying to accomplish more in one, okay? And it's, because especially with like team sport athletes, like they don't need to sell out on one adaptation, right? They have multiple needs on the field, right? For alignment, right? They have more of a need to like block and like have strength. But at the same time, like they might have plays where they got to pull out as guard and they have to run down the field or on a screen or something. Like they still need to have power and speed, right? They also still need to maintain their size, right? So they have a lot of different needs at once. So there's different types of periodization models depending on where you're at, what you're trying to do. Okay, so that's exercise order. If you have any questions, reach out to me. We can go over some stuff, but this is like kind of making us move in the right direction on programming and like what that actually looks like. We've looked at the principles, we looked at some movements, we looked at some different adaptations, right? So once you know the adaptation that you're looking for, then you can start to say, all right, how does that manifest itself? And that manifests itself in exercise order. Okay, so go ahead and move on to the next lecture.